Good afternoon. I'm Ronnie Bryant, Chairman of the Board of the Institute for a Worker in the Economy, and I would like to welcome each of you to our Day After project. The purpose of this segment is to introduce you to the Day After project and to give you some insight on our agenda for this afternoon. The Institute for Work in the Economy is a policy-based collaborative based in Chicago. Stepped forward in April of 2020 to begin a series of virtual day after conversations with two goals in mind. Number one, to come up with a set of individual and collective actions that face the challenges and seize the corresponding opportunities for change. And number two, to discover larger ideas from these conversations, report them as general understandings, and after these findings, as contributions to a broad public policy agenda. Altogether, the Institute and its partners convened 9 gatherings involving 150 participants who are engaged directly with people in their respective communities. We did not condition any of the conversations on funding. Our partners included Source America, who volunteered as a funding partner, the National Urban League, PHI, a leader in long-term care, and Nebraska Community Foundation. The Institute organized 2 conversations in the greater Charlotte-Mecklenburg region, and the pilot conversation in the Chicago-Cook metro area was organized in collaboration with Cook County Commissioner Alma Anaya's office. Participants were asked to imagine how the events that are defining 2020 can be used to achieve greater good and what that means for the day after. Each of these conversations was 2 hours and was conducted virtually on Zoom. Everyone on the calls took the floor and freely expressed their views, knowing our promise that nothing would be attributed without explicit permission. The purpose of today's webinar is to share what we have learned so far. In keeping with our promise to our partners, this webinar focuses on what they have gained from the initiative. We will finish with our thoughts about the next steps and how it is influencing the Institute's theory of change that is guiding our future of work. Earlier this fall, the Institute's Day After project received broad attention at the Kaufman Foundation ESIP conference. Kaufman's ESIP leader, Andy Stowe, interviewed Mary Wright, the project chair and board member, and Peter Kratikos, the Institute's president. We asked Andy to lead a conversation with Mary and another board member, Elizabeth Diane White, to describe some of the broad lessons that have been learned by the Institute over the course of the year. Andy is a senior program officer at the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation, where he is responsible for the implementation and management of the foundation's entrepreneurial ecosystem development strategy. Before joining the Kaufman Foundation, Stowe co-founded Seed Here Studio, a social good company specializing in building innovation ecosystems in unexpected places. Please welcome Andy Stowe.
Thanks, Ronnie. Thanks for the introduction. Excited to bring Mary and Elizabeth up to the stage here and to have a bit of a conversation. I am the least important person in this conversation. My job is to keep this interesting. We're going to talk for about 20 minutes here, and to kind of warm us up for the rest of the presentations and conversations that we're going to have, of all of the insights and the perspectives that were gained through these 9 conversations that happen in communities across the country. So I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to host Mary and Peter to sort of start this conversation a couple of months ago in September, but 3 months has passed since then, and in COVID terms, that's like 3 decades. So I'm sure a lot more has surfaced. And so I want to give some space and some time for Mary and Elizabeth to help warm us up, because they were involved in some of these conversations. And Mary, I'm going to start with you because you and I had a great conversation back in September. For those of you maybe who don't know Mary, Mary is a woman of many hats, a manager at the Sherm Foundation, and in our particular role today, you're a member of the board here at the Institute. You actually chair the Institute's Achieving the Promise of Work initiative, which is part of the group that's hosting all of this or leading all of this. And you have a deep background in connecting the public and private sectors to address many different challenges in our community. And you had the opportunity to sit in a couple of these conversations and help, I believe, facilitate them. So I want to, just to get the energy going, I'm going to start sort of in a very specific way, which is thinking about conversations you're in. What is one like aha or holy crap or thing that really caught you in one of the conversations that you think about still to this day?
Well, Andy, thank you for that introduction, and I'm really glad to be here with all of you today. You know, you're asking this question of, you know, how do you boil down, or how do you remember the one thing that just sort of, you know, knocked me off my whatever during these conversations. And there was so much material and so much richness that came through in these conversations. But I think that you know, one of the premises of the whole set of the conversations was that we needed to talk to the folks whose voices were not often heard. And that was really a sort of a primary focus of who we invited and who we wanted to be sure was included in these conversations. And sort of like what we say to senior executives, you need to go out more, right, to sort of hear what's going on. So I think the one statement that came to me that just really brought a whole focus to this whole series of conversations for me was talking with the folks who were in Massachusetts around long-term care and there was a woman who told the story of essentially watching the folks who were actually on the front lines, that these long-term care workers who are poor are helping the poor. And that notion that the folks who are really trying to make a significant difference to people's lives really have no voice either. And to me, that just was it sort of brings back that whole thing around who needs to be who is in a position to make change. And the people who are most affected in many cases certainly are not the people who have the ability or the voice to make change. So for me, that was again, many of these things you go, well, Mary, of course, you should have been able to figure this out. But when you actually hear the direct story, it somehow makes a bigger impression. So that was one that I think just has stuck with me through all of these conversations.
Yeah, I think that that's some of my experience of just like intellectually understanding an idea, but then when you actually hear someone voice it, especially someone whose maybe voice wasn't heard, it sticks you in a very different way. I'm going to shift this over to Elizabeth and bring Elizabeth in. Elizabeth, your biography describes you as an aging solutions advocate, especially for older adults facing uncertain work and financial insecurity, which describes actually a lot of folks in 2020, even more than I think we had prior to the pandemic. Your story I find fascinating. You had a bout earlier in your life with long-term unemployment. You went looking for a book to help you. Being unable to find that book, you decided to write it yourself.
Yes.
So the book 55, Underemployed and Faking Normal, Your Guide to a Better Life. And in the actual book cover, it says Your Guide to a Better, and Retirement is crossed out, it says Better Life. And in that book, you share the stories you've lived. You also bring your expertise as a Harvard MBA, former entrepreneur, C-suite executive, and really in a situation that I'm sure, my sense is at the time, you did not expect to find yourself in. So you can probably have some empathy for many people in the pandemic and all that's been 2020. So you're joining us today with the hat as a board member of the Institute of Work and the Economy. So I'll start you off with the same question. You were involved in some of these conversations. Is there any one or two things that stuck with you or sort of gave you an aha moment in listening to folks and what they had to say?
Yes. So thank you, Andy. And so happy to be here with all of you. I think the thing that really stuck with me was we are at this reckoning. And so many of the people recognize that we're at this reckoning on race and wonder, will it be short-term or long-term? Will funders actually step up or will we have a situation where we'll get race fatigue, early on, and we'll be back to some kind of normal? Or will we get what they call virtue signaling? Or will we get performative acts that really don't move the needle? And is it possible at this time to sort of change how a funder and a service provider engage? Can we have a much longer term partnership where we're not every few months having to go back to the well? Can we think strategically about what are the big goals that we want to achieve here, and what will be the investment that's really required to do it over the longer term? And some fear, because if you are on the receiving end, if you're constantly out raising money, I found that there was a scarcity mentality, that there's not enough, or we might not get it next year, or we can't think in a big enough way about the problems that we are confronting. And we know that we need to be dealing with the systemic issues that are causing them. So not just the fire, but what caused the fire. And to do that, you need money, and you need to be able to predict that you will have money this year and in the years following. You may want to do something that's more entrepreneurial that may not work. So you want your funder, your partner, to really be with you in, can we experiment a little bit here? Can we test some new ideas? Can we go bigger than we've gone before? And to do that with the funder, you really need more of a partnership than typically would describe what many organizations have. So that was something that struck me.
Great. I think that's in the conversation we actually had a couple of months ago, we talked about having to reorganize the way we relate to each other, and by every possible way you could possibly divide that, whether it's the way institutions relate to folks in the community, whether folks of different races or genders or rural versus urban. We have to rethink how how we relate and how we work together, because clearly the way we've been doing it isn't exactly working very well. Mary, I want to ask you, in our conversation, we talked a little bit about, a couple months ago, we talked a little bit about how some patterns that were emerging across the mini groups, some things you were hearing over and over again. And one of them that really struck me was that you and Peter mentioned that there's almost a demand for significant change, that people in all walks of life are saying, this is not working. We need to change some things. That was like a universal call across all 9 of the conversations. Were there other patterns that you heard or you saw that just kind of showed up in every room, or when you heard it the third time, you kind of were like, okay, that's definitely something we need to pin to the final analysis on this?
Yeah, I think that what was interesting was, as you were saying, that there were certain themes that came across. Certainly, this issue around funding. Well, I guess I should say that this whole COVID thing has sort of ripped the Band-Aid off a lot of things, right? And we're now being able to see the fault lines of things that are just not quite right. And so, talking about this funding issue around. And this is sort of a long-term issue that a lot of nonprofits have had consistently of, how adventuresome can I be? How dynamic can I be? But I have a goal that I'm supposed to be achieving, which I don't know how to measure for it because I don't have the money to figure out how to measure it. I mean, there's just so many of these things that have been a problem. But I think what was interesting was, of course, there was a consistent drumbeat around access to the internet and all the stuff around broadband. And Lord knows we've been hearing about this for years, whether, we're still talking about rural areas or high density urban areas. But unless you have this ability to, have that access, we can't do remote work. We can't have this kind of fully integrated system that we would love to have. I think there was also interesting conversations around, certainly power dynamics and who had the power and where was that going to go. But I think the other thing was how, where people were also seeing opportunities. So this issue around remote work, that there was really, certainly for rural areas, there was certainly that sense of, well, now we really gives us a much greater ability to compete as compared to, either coast. Certainly for people with disabilities, talking about the kind of opportunities that this was now bringing up. So I think there was a sense of, I think everyone sort of said, okay, yes, this isn't so good. This is a really terrible space to be in. But that sense of, we can take advantage of this. And certainly the tried and true and sort of overused thing of a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. How is it that you can find new partners and find new common ground around where you can try to get together? I think the concept of silos and the notion of, that people have been put into buckets and they're stuck in those buckets, and there are places where they would really like to cooperate or collaborate with other folks, but just haven't had the demand or haven't had the pressure that they recognize they really have to now. We see that there's going to be, I think, hopefully some changes around people's resistance to that because they can see opportunities. So those are a couple of the other sort of bigger themes that I think we began to see.
How about you, Elizabeth? Looking across all the conversations, I know you all are working on making sense of all the conversations. It's partially the role of leaders, and I think crisis moments is to help bring people together and hear what people have to say, then make sense of it. Are there other patterns that you saw in those conversations, Elizabeth, that you'd like to elevate or you think are important that we highlight in this opening session?
So one of the things is in the whole area of entrepreneurship. So when I think of sort of the startup ecosystem, it is typically focused on growth and, I think of, sort of home run hits and multi-million-dollar exits. And here, where because of the issues around work, that you have people, necessity entrepreneurs, they can't find other work, that they really want how do you create a small business that will help to support them? So it might be part of a casserole of some gig work and then a small, entrepreneurial venture. And in this ecosystem that focuses on growth and being big, and there aren't many places where you can get a $15,000 loan instead of $1.5 million loan, or a place where someone who has an idea but needs help in fleshing it out. And actually, how do you start a business? And so I think that this whole area of entrepreneurship, when there aren't jobs to be had, and how you become a successful business and stay small, because some of these companies actually wish to stay small. That's something we don't explore enough on the entrepreneurial side.
That's right. And I think the themes that came up in some of our earlier conversations about this really looks at how do we build more inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystems that help people who are typically just not even invited into the conversation participate. And then to loop in what you said, Mary, there about the internet, is that entrepreneurship in many ways, because of the internet, has been democratized, and it makes entrepreneurship more accessible to people in rural communities or maybe communities that don't have large populations. So again, how do we make sure that those resources are available for everyone, especially those that are left out? And that came up, I know, over and over again in many of the conversations, and intentional efforts to make sure that equity and inclusion were baked into the entrepreneurial efforts, or the efforts of some entrepreneurs. Let's talk about inclusion for just a second. So the quote that has struck me the most in the pandemic comes from Margaret Wheatley. She said, "We're not all in the same boat. But we're all in the same storm, and some of us are in yachts, and some of us are in dinghies, and some of us can't swim. How, sort of playing off that quote, how has issues of diversity, equity, inclusion come up within the conversations that you had? And is there any specific things that you heard that you thought, oh, that's something we could act on? I think one is specifically looking at how do we build more inclusive entrepreneurial communities? How do we make sure those resources aren't just, aren't too far away or kept, barriers are in the way to get folks to those entrepreneurial resources. What other things have you heard in the conversations amongst folks about ways we can address diversity, equity, inclusion on the day after, or starting on the day after? Mary, I'll let you start.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just the constant reminder that of which socioeconomic groups were most adversely affected by COVID. And sort of the fact that if you could work from home and you had internet access and life is actually kind of okay, and you have money because you're not traveling, and so the home renovation business is booming. But if you really are a frontline worker, or you're in retail, or you're in hospitality, that whole segment is just frozen, right? And so I think that keeps coming back in terms of some of the stuff that we've talked about in terms of the future of work, and what was it going to be like, and how's that going to sort of all what are the skills that people are going to have, and where are we going to have to go? It really does come down again, though, to who is most prepared to deal with this. And it does come down to issues of equity and, both people of color and people with disabilities, and the whole group of quote underserved populations. And it's going to, so I think it's just that constant remembering that that both the physical and the mental and the economic impact of COVID is disproportionately affecting people of color and underserved populations. And I think that just keeps coming up as reminding us that every program or every answer or every partnership or anything that we look at has to be viewed from is this inequitable? Look, are we being inclusive? Are we remembering diversity? And I think it's become so much more front and center for everyone as they begin to think about what's the next solution. So I think it's no longer sort of at the end of the conversation about a change in policy. It's not at the end anymore. It's really become much more front and center. So there isn't one that sort of comes to me as it just was so evident in everything people talked about was, again, okay, but what does that really do? How does that help? Where's the change? How's that going to happen? And so I think it's an opportunity, because you see major employers having to really rethink if they are going to rehire, what are they doing? How are they going to put the pieces, what programs are they going to put in place that get us out of the systems and structures that were there before?
Elizabeth, what are you thinking?
Yeah, and I would add that there's a way that people are directly impacted that was not the case before. So if your 87-year-old mother has a home health aide coming to take care of her in your home, and that home health aide, who makes $17,000 a year, has to take 2 buses and the subway to get where she lives, and she doesn't have the proper PPE, and she doesn't have healthcare coverage herself, then she's at risk. And so now is your mother. And if it's the same with your childcare worker, or if there's your favorite hamburger joint, you've gone and someone on the wait staff is sick and comes in because they have to work, because they don't have sick leave, suddenly now you are at risk as well. So I think that I think of it, your storm analogy, I think of the Titanic, where something like 65% of the people in first class survived, 42% in second class, and only 25% in third class. It's the same point, but there is a way through those 2 examples that I gave, whether it's your childcare provider, or where you may not have before cared where she lived or how she got there or under what circumstances. Now, as there is interface in your own life with people that maybe you didn't see before. Now their health status impacts you. So I think there is the more general point that we all recognize our connectedness, but then there is the specific point that we are much more connected, in a day-to-day, real life way than we were in the past.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's very powerful. The irony is that we're all driven to be individually in our homes and apart, but it has only reminded us how interconnected we are, and the solutions are going to be interconnected. I think one thing that I'm taking away from this project, and even just reading some of the notes, is that you can't have your conversation about entrepreneurship over here while you're having your conversation about like elderly care over here while you're talking about schools over here. It's all interrelated, and that what the themes that are coming across all these conversations, they're different types of folks who think about different types of things. The interconnected nature of all of them is incredibly important. And so credit to both of you and your roles on the board in hosting these conversations. And obviously your leadership throughout this project. We are going to take some questions from the audience if people have questions. Happy to do that. But then we're actually going to shift after this into some conversations with some of the partners who helped host the conversations, or you worked alongside to host, and actually start talking about how do we turn some of this stuff we've learned and heard into action, and what are those actions going to be. So that'll be the next segment, but I'm opening it up. If folks have conversations, I think you can share it in the Q&A little widget down on the bottom. I am going to, I'm going to read see if there's any questions, so throw them in there, but let me just start actually with a question that I have, which is y'all did something that a lot of people skipped, which is like, we're going to change the world, we're going to solve social problems. And then you go in a back room and you make a plan. You did the opposite. You said, let's convene people to have a conversation. You got folks in the room, as Mary said, voices that maybe haven't been heard. I'll start with you, Elizabeth. What's something you've learned about the importance of actually convening the community and listening to the community and doing this type of work, whether from this project or your other experiences?
I think it's always important to start with the people. And I think often and to do it in a way that is not perfunctory. So we've all seen where there's going to be a big development somewhere, and the developer comes in, conducts a little meeting with the neighborhood, and then does whatever they want. I think what's different here is having the work really guided by the input that we're getting, and making a real effort to have those diverse voices at the table, and really thinking about who might not be there that should be there, and investing some time in that. And I think particularly when you have organizations that do this work a lot and they're good at it, they can come in with a point of view that they then start selectively sort of shaping the conversation and the outcomes in the direction that they want. And I think there's a real effort here to not do that, to be open to wherever the conversation takes us.
Yeah, and my sense is you all spend a lot of time thinking about how you convene people. What are the invitations? How do we invite people in the room? Making sure it's not a transactional, come to this so you can get this. Making sure people feel welcome. I mean, everything down to the way you write the emails, to the way you ask questions, to the way to moderate. I mean, there's so much that you learn. Is probably a whole separate book on just how to convene these types of conversations. So that's wonderful. Mary, I'm going to jump over to you with another question we have in the Q&A. We know public-private collaboration is going to be essential on day one. You have spent your entire career trying to weave and network these types of collaborations together. What advice do you have to, whether it's the partner organizations or someone listening, trying to put together a public-private partnership? What should we keep top of mind as we begin to sort of build those on the day after?
I guess I would really sort of think about, it's sort of, how do we get out of those silos that we come with, right? So it's not, we have to be thinking about what we're trying to solve, not how I'm going to contribute towards it, sort of speaking. I guess it's sort of like my greatest example of, a mayor of Indianapolis who came in and said, he had each department in a staff meeting, and the police said, well, we got this many crimes, and the library said we did this many books, and the water department said we had this many miles of whatever. And he said, no, I want to understand what happened in College Town neighborhood. Mm. And I think it's that sort of thought process around how do we come to the table with the idea of this is either group of people, or this is the problem we want to solve, and how is it that we each contribute to it, and not consistently think about, well, I have to do, all of this is mine, or I can't share a resource with somebody else to try to collaborate and provide. And I can't collaborate because then I will lose power around this. And I think it really is thinking about, so if we want to have whatever that sort of thing is that we've decided is most important, how do we each contribute to that in order to be successful?
I think that's great. And I think that's a great way for us to wrap this conversation. How do each of us contribute, but then how do those things work together? I think one of the things we've learned in the work that we've been doing at the Kauffman Foundation around entrepreneurial ecosystems is the power of any system isn't in the individual parts, but it's actually how those parts interact. And so if we can get folks, especially from different perspectives, different backgrounds, to come together and find ways that they can actually collaborate, that's how you get sort of 1 + 1 = 5. But what we also know is that collaboration moves at the speed of trust. And so that you have to spend the requisite time to build the trust, especially in places and communities where maybe that trust has been damaged. There's a little bit of healing that has to happen.
And I think one quick thing I would say is that government can be great conveners. They can bring private sector entities to the table in a way that sort of nobody else can. And so that's, I think, a key. I know in the space that I'm in, I'm very interested in multi-generational workforce. And I'm not interested in laggard companies. I'm interested in the companies that are really doing this well and out front. And government can do sometimes the convening of that in a way that other organizations, nobody else would have their, sort of voice and megaphone.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. That's wonderful. Mary, the folks at the Institute have convened us today. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We're going to have to move on to the next segment, but thank you both for your leadership in this project and sharing your insights in this limited amount of time we had. I'm going to pass the mic over to Whitney Kimball-Cole, who's going to help set us up. I think Elizabeth and Mary's done a good job warming us up. We're thinking about this stuff now. Whitney, you're going to take over, have some of the partners reflect on what they're seeing, and then we're going to start talking a little bit more about how you start turning some of these insights into actions and see where the conversation takes us. Whitney, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was a really great conversation. And what a wonderful facilitator you are, and Mary and Elizabeth. It was great to listen to those takeaways. So I get to facilitate this next panel of 5 incredible partners, folks from local communities who hosted some of these conversations, who participated in them. And we get to ask them a few questions about, what they've learned. What are some of the benefits of being participants in this conversation? What are some of the next steps that we see inspired by these conversations in these communities? So really quickly, my name is Whitney Kimball-Cole. I am a vice president with Center for Rural Strategies, and at the Center for Rural Strategies, I direct one of our anchor programs called the Rural Assembly. And the Rural Assembly is a movement of rural leaders and organizations that work across sectors to build a more inclusive nation, one that values all the people and all the places. And we've been around for about a decade. And some of the themes that I heard Mary and Elizabeth talking about felt so resonant to me from my perspective, working with the Rural Assembly. The need for integrated planning and thinking and talking and conversations is just it's so huge and so important. And also that change moves at the speed of relationship and trust. I think those are really important takeaways from that last conversation as well. So I'm really excited to get to meet. I'm meeting these folks along with many of you in the audience. I'm excited to meet Kinston and Casey and Wah and Amy and Shane. And I'm going to invite each of them to introduce themselves and offer you just a short bit of reflection about their experience as hosts and as participants, and invite them also to tell us a little bit about what the next steps that these conversations inspired for them. So Casey, would you like to go first?
All right. Thank you, Whitney. Good afternoon, everyone. Casey Balitz. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the Nebraska Community Foundation. We convened a statewide conversation, and I am certainly mindful of the challenge of boiling down a statewide conversation into just a couple minutes of reflections. So we'll do the best we can to find the common themes. And I would say that there's a lot of commonality in what we just heard as well. And clearly what we have seen this year is an inflection point, perhaps the most significant in our lifetimes, probably, if we think about what is the day after in the nature of work and workforce and workplace. And certainly the Nebraska conversation reflected that. We had a good diversity of geography and background and profession in our statewide conversation, and across the board. I think one theme that rang clear for us was the scope of the challenge is very often equal to the scope of the opportunity in life. And I think this is a case where 2020 has been a significant challenge, obviously. But I think for the state of Nebraska, we heard from all the folks in our conversation that it also is going to represent significant opportunity in 2021. The challenges, and it's already been mentioned, broadband access relates to the opportunity in remote work. The challenge in diversity and inclusion relates to the opportunity in creating welcoming communities, and the scope of those things very much balances out. So the reality in Nebraska for many years has been that workforce is a significant challenge. We've been top 1, 2, 3 in terms of the lowest unemployment rate in the nation for years. And so that's a significant challenge. We think now, or at least what we heard in this conversation, is there is then a corresponding opportunity there as well because of remote work, because of the changing acceptability of doing these things from anywhere. We felt like as a state that we really do have opportunities in this inflection point. I think so, next steps, where does it go from here? Where does this conversation take us? Clearly, the platform that this conversation gave us as a state is reinforcing what I think some probably already knew, but that the intersection of community development, workforce development, and economic development, that's the sweet spot going forward. And it's some of what Andy was just talking about with, not having those silos. Well, that's true here as well, that you can't do workforce development without community development. You can't do economic development without workforce development, et cetera. All of these disciplines are going to have to come together for us to be successful in providing opportunities for those businesses who create the jobs, et cetera. It's just all becoming one combined discipline. And that's been very clear, I think, over this last year. We had folks talk about, the challenges, obviously, of being forced to work from home, but then if you had the broadband access, it became an opportunity. The challenge probably, and I think it's clear within Nebraska, and I would assume we'll hear that it's very clear between Nebraska and other conversations that happened, is that we're going to have to be very intentional about not allowing this to become a dividing line and growing the gap between haves and have-nots, whether that's broadband or other kinds of opportunity. That's just one example. So a lot of what we've already heard today is about that intentionality of making sure everyone's at the table, everyone's included in those opportunities. I think we have a choice as a state, in the case of Nebraska, or as a cohort that's on this call together. We have a choice here in this significant inflection point to do that well and really make long-term systemic changes that are going to be positive for everyone, or doing business as usual and seeing that gap continue to grow. And I hope that's a choice that we all get together and talk about as a cohort. I'd love to see these day after conversations go toward connecting thought leaders, best practices. How do we do these things intentionally? So those were some of the themes I think that we heard from Nebraska.
Thank you so much. That's really great. And I want to invite Kinston to share.
Well, hello and good afternoon to everyone. I am Kinston Griffin with Dream Builders Communication. We're an assessment, training, and process improvement firm, and I reside in Charlotte, North Carolina. So I think Peter and Ronnie tricked me. They were like, Dr. Griffin, we need some help. It was a quick way to say we need some free assessments. So, but no, I want to thank them for allowing us the opportunity. Charlotte, we did a different approach. We took what we would call the normal suspects, and I put that in quote, and then we picked the boots on the ground individuals, and we finally got everybody in the room together. So when we start talking about, and I'm gonna stick to the script, so I'm looking at it, what we learned is we thought we were aligned, we thought we were on the same page, and we thought we had the same vision. We do not. So that's what we really learned. But the reason we learned that is because we finally had the people that had some resources in the room with the people that had passion in the room. And when the passion and the purse finally got in the room together, that's where we started seeing some levels of alignment. The second thing is, what do we believe that the results, the benefits of the participants? What we had is no one had a title. We intentionally said no doctor this and no CEO that. And we just wanted to learn from each other. I see you snapping, girl. I see you. We didn't have titles, so we got away from the doctors and the MBAs. And people are like, what's an MBA? That is a mega bank account. You can use that one. So we got away from all of those things, and we just started talking. And once again, Peter and Ronnie really laid it out. But the third thing that we learned is somebody in that Zoom, because it was in a Zoom versus a room, somebody in that Zoom had to own it. So, I was doing like this. And you know who had to be one of the persons that owned it? It was myself and a gentleman by the name of Manuel Campbell, who's a great entrepreneur and leader. But what we talked about is, after we owned it, we talked about, well, what would be some of the next steps? Because we had the quote unquote individuals in the room. So we've actually developed our own assessment. And since that's one of the things our company does, it made it a little easy. We did an assessment for the individuals that were in the Zoom, and we've sent it out to them. And now they're going to tell us what the next steps are. Because what we found is most people would say the right things when they were in the Zoom, but people went back to their jobs, people went back to their homes, people went back to their, what we would call normal settings. So what we've done is this assessment will tell us what are some of the next steps. One of the things that we wanted to know is, what are you doing before we had the day after conversation? Some people were already in this space. The second question that we had on the assessment is, what type of time do you really have? I mean, all of this sounds good, but what time do you have? The third question is, what time are you willing to give? Because we don't have the resources as of right now. So what time are you willing to give as we go search this out to find the resources? Then here was a big one. Who's going to own what if we do receive the resources? I'm in the South, so we like to call it, we play Southern nice when no one actually has it. But when the resources start to come in, it is amazing that where hands begin to pop up and I'm in and I'm there. But we started doing this 12 months ago. So we're with this assessment, we're hoping we can identify who's really going to put their time in. We know that we have access to certain levels of capital. Many of you all probably saw what happened with the McKinseys just a few days ago with the billions of dollars that was given. But if you don't have the right message, what was it? So this is what we closed out with, and this is how I'll close. What we said is we wanted to be aware together. We wanted to align as best as we could as a collective entity. And we wanted to be agile and be able to pivot and shift, because we will not go back to what one would know as normal if there is a such thing. So since we won't go back to normal, can we now create our new norm inside of this. We've heard the new norm, and Manuel and I kind of used the movie The Day After Tomorrow. It was a big snowstorm, and in this big snowstorm, this father was trying to get to his son. But what we found out is no matter what happened, the father didn't quit. So what we've made a commitment in Charlotte is this time, and we do mean this time, because of Ronnie and Peter's courage and courageousness, we're bringing everybody to the table. Straight, gay, LGBTQA, resources, no resources. Let's pull away the mask of these titles and let's really have a conversation. Are we there yet? I got a quick answer. No. But as we continue to talk, we're starting to learn each other. Last thing I'll say is people do business with people they like. So if you like us, we will do business together. So those are some of the things that we learned. Whitney, thank you so much for hosting us.
Oh, absolutely. That's great. And there are already some common themes here, which is exciting to talk about in a minute. So let's see, Wah, would you tell us about your reflections?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me today. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wah Pham, and I'm here representing the Urban League of Philadelphia and the conversation that I had with my colleagues across the National Urban League network. I just want to quickly say that I'm really grateful to be here and to be able to share my perspectives, but also be in this room with this wonderful panel. You're all doing such incredible work in your community, so I'm grateful to learn from you as well. So for those of you who are not familiar with the National Urban League, I hope you are, but just in case, we are the oldest, largest civil rights movement in this country. We have local chapters or affiliates across the country, like in my own hometown here in Philadelphia. My discussion with my counterparts across the Urban League network was unsurprisingly an incredibly passionate one. That should absolutely not come as a surprise. It was a roundtable of civil rights activists who are fighting for equity and power and parity every single day. So I would say that as a participant in that room, that the tone, that virtual room, the tone all at once felt, unsurprised at what has been happening in our country, to personally feeling really mentally exhausted. And I would say most importantly, 3, feeling really fired up. Our group felt incredibly hopeful that this national attention, whether it was renewed or new, could drive some good. I'm heartened to hear a couple of folks reference this earlier in the session, but it goes without saying that if you are a Black or brown person in this country, you haven't had a choice but to be keenly aware when another young man that looks like your son or your cousin has been murdered, or if you know that 5 members of your family have been laid off or don't have the luxury of working a white-collar job from the safety of their home, or have been hospitalized or died from COVID. We know it is abundantly clear now the disproportionate inequities that exist within our system, whether it's simply biracial dynamics, economic inequity, health inequality throughout our country. And in our conversation, I'm so grateful for it because it felt like there was such deep catharsis in that room, virtual room. And it feels now, in the months that have passed, that we can point now to very clear, loud, Black and white examples of where things are not right, and they haven't been for quite some time. And, moving forward, when I think about the day after, I think that we have an opportunity to be much more pointed in our conversations and in our actions with our allies and our accomplices. Our group felt very strongly that there is, in fact, a difference between the two. With people and with organizations who are allies in name, but need pushing to do more. I'm personally really excited, and also on behalf of folks organizing in Philadelphia, that this attention, this momentum is going to be used to swing hard rather than focusing just on the crumbs. I'm not personally interested in talking about $10,000 worth of investments to solve poverty in Philadelphia. I want to take this moment and this attention and point to all of those George Floyd statements that foundations and companies went live with, or their blacked out social media. I want to take this moment, point to it and say, if you are serious about addressing inequity in your communities, in our communities, it's not $10,000 of investment, it's $10 million worth of investment. It's time, it's sweat equity, it is ceding power, it is creating spaces for people of color, folks who have historically been underrepresented, bringing them into the C-suites, bringing them into the boardrooms, making massive investments into education where we haven't seen it in decades. All right, I'm going to go off the rails, so I'm just going to stop there because we've got so much more to share. But I would say, in short, my experience in that conversation was one full of gratitude and getting to just connect with other folks who are doing this work all across the country, of feeling heard and re-seen and renewed in this feeling that this is our moment. Let's turn it into a movement. And now let's point to the things that people have said publicly and push for more. And I'm sure there will be more to come.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Amy, could you weigh in now?
Sure, thanks, Whitney. I too am just very grateful to be here with you all today. I'm just already learning so much and excited for the conversation. So I'm Amy Robbins, and I'm a consultant who is focused on workforce innovation in the long-term care space. I helped organize the Massachusetts convening, which sounds like they all kind of took a little bit of a different focus. This one was directly focused on the direct care workforce. So the home health aides, the nurse aides, the PCAs who all provide frontline services to in long-term care settings. This is it's a high growth occupation, and yet it ticks every box in terms of issues with job quality. They're low pay, high turnover, job satisfaction, everything, right? And they are predominantly staffed, filled by women and by people of color and immigrants, and predominantly, well, I guess I would say that the trifecta of factors that we have been dealing with over the past 8 months with COVID, with calls for racial equity and the Black Lives Matter movement, and sort of the fallout of the economy for certain segments of the population has really hit this workforce head on. And I think it has also really laid bare for us the lack of investment in our long-term care structure or system in this country. We have seen this workforce. We have seen the impact of this lack of investment in a way that has never been seen before, right? This invisible, services that happen in people's homes or behind closed doors in nursing homes. We all saw it, and some people saw it for the very first time for what it was not doing for the people that it was serving and for the workers that work in those settings. And so we came into this conversation really, I think, with several people in our group having been just trying to get through every single day of the last 8 months and provide support to these workers and support to the people that they were serving. And so this conversation, I think, really provided an opportunity for them to just take a step back and go, wow, like we are in a moment of opportunity. And if we don't change this big time, we have lost something really important. I think where we got to in the conversation was that despite the challenges and despite the just the pure exhaustion, I think why you mentioned that, just the pure exhaustion of the last 8 months, that people brought a lot of energy to it and wanted to see change and wanted to work on it together. What we do with that is really, there's these big systems issues, right? This is about our country's values. This is about what we think about Black and Brown people. This is also about how we treat elders and people who are marginalized in our community by their age or by a medical condition, any number of things. And they have historically been quite disregarded. And I think we in our group felt that something had shifted, or at least a door had opened. There was a new opportunity to rethink this, and that we had policymakers engaged in it, or at least more aware, and as well as the general public, not, feeling like this is not okay. And so we came away from our conversation feeling like there was a real need for systems change. And I'm hearing a number of comments from before that. Casey, you said, if the challenge is equal to the opportunity, I think we're in an awesome spot then for in the long-term care arena in particular. And Elizabeth was talking about the need to look really long-term in terms of financial investment. And I think that is absolutely what it's going to take in this setting. In particular, we know what to do. I think our group was pretty clear. We have a lot of solutions that have worked over time. We haven't been able to codify them. We haven't been able to, have them really become the system of the future. They're short-term, funding initiatives, and then they go away and we're back to where we were, to square one. So if it is true that we are, more connected than we've ever been before, and I do feel like that is true, then I am hopeful that we will be able to really work on these solutions and get somewhere that people will have seen this workforce in a new light, and their impact on our community in a new way, and that'll get us going in the right direction.
Oh, thank you, Amy. I love how you all are being so upfront and honest and vulnerable about how exhausting and exhilarating these conversations were. I think that's just really spectacular. So Shane, tell us about your reflections.
Sure. So thank you, Whitney, and fellow panelists, for the opportunity to join you today. I'm Shane Kennedy. I'm the Vice President for Workforce Development for Source America, and we're a central nonprofit agency focused on increased employment for persons with disabilities. I've also had the good fortune of working with Peter and Mary with the Institute for Work over the past year. So I'm pleased to share some of the examples of what we learned from our day after events, and some of the benefits, and what we've been doing as a result. So for context, we held 2 sessions. One was with provider organizations to offer a local perspective, and the second was with national organizations to offer a macro perspective, and they came from different domains, whether it was policy making, university systems, representing provider organizations at a larger umbrella level, a lot of different perspectives there. And this is important because those groups often have very different opinions of how to achieve their shared goal of increased employment for persons with disabilities. And they also have very different experiences with major environmental disruptions. It's also noteworthy that the pandemic and economic downturn add to the complexity of major policy shifts within the disability community that reflect ongoing and changing social expectations of inclusion. So there is a convergence of different factors that are applying a very different kind of pressure on the disability community for transformation in the midst of the pandemic and the economic situation. So given that context, the viewpoints we heard strike a balance between optimism and pessimism, which some might prefer to call practicality. And some of the themes you will see in the reports on the Institute's website include a duality of how persons with disabilities are perceived during and following the pandemic. So are they an untapped, resilient frontline workforce, or are they the subject of assumed risk based on perceived vulnerability to health events? Right? That is a reality that has to be confronted. There's great optimism about the opportunities presented by the increase in remote work, but the structural issues of accessibility, affordability, connectivity, and usability of technology must also be addressed. Right? It's not a panacea. It should not be taken for granted that remote work is the answer for all persons with disabilities and employment, because there are all these structural issues that exist. And there's also a concern that remote work might become the assumed default for persons with disabilities because of perceptions of vulnerabilities, or because of any sort of fear or risk associated with bringing someone into the workplace. And that might undermine the entire goal of inclusive workplace culture. Current events can serve as a positive and necessary inflection point for innovation within the provider community. We've seen that. We've seen providers moving to remote services. We've seen different ways of trying to reach out to the community. And there's a need to share that information and get that out there amongst the provider community. But state systems and funding mechanisms must also respond to that same speed of change. Current events have also underscored how access to transportation has remained a persistent hurdle for many within the disability community, especially when that infrastructure is shut down because of a pandemic. And overall, there's a concern that any of the progress in employment for persons with disabilities that were gained leading up to the pandemic following the last economic recovery might ultimately be lost and might ultimately be wiped out because of current events and the lasting cyclical effects of economic crises in the United States and how that manifests for persons with disabilities. While many of these issues are not new, they have taken on a different level of urgency or complexity due to the pandemic and the economic situation. So in terms of next steps, I'd like to offer a practical example. Several of the participants from the Day After event have been working together on a national survey. It was a survey instrument that was already out there rolling, talking about the current effects of the pandemic. But we are now teaming up to start asking provocative questions about what might be the future, what might happen in 1 to 3 years. Is there something to pay attention to in terms of attrition within the provider community, sustainability with the service models that are out there, and then the compounding effect that has on people and their families and their local, state, and national perspectives of the economy, culture, and those sorts of things. And then from a larger social perspective, there seems to be a growing awareness of two important areas. The recognition of the intersectional identities represented in the disability community, which span all combination of demographics. The disability community is representationally of the most diverse kind of intersection of the human experience. An acknowledgement of acquired disability as a contributing factor to the growth and diversity of the community. For example, the physical and mental effects of the pandemic that we might see in years to come. So with that awareness, with those two things comes a recognition of the negative effects that people with disabilities have experienced during past events. That leads to a responsibility for better policymaking, more informed policymaking that gives equal consideration to the disability community as we prepare for an inclusive national recovery.
Thank you so much, Shane. And to all of you for those reflections. Those were so deep and thorough. And I heard a lot of common themes supported beneath them, and I understand you all were in different communities and maybe focused on different issues in some ways, but it sounds like a lot of conversations went in similar directions around equity and around justice and around making sure that we don't miss this opportunity that's in front of us. I hear deep awareness of the moment of 2020 and what we've been through. And making sure that we don't go back to the old way of doing things or just the normal, that we don't settle for normal. We don't settle for that $10,000 grant to solve poverty, but we actually progress beyond that. So I think that's really incredible that you all brought all of that up in just these few minutes. And for a time check, it looks like I have time to ask you one question that we can do a quick round robin, and then we'll get questions from the audience. And so I've been sitting here trying to think, what can I do with this one question that I get to ask you guys? And so I guess I want to know, it has to do with the gaps in service and accessibility and opportunity that you all described, that you all referenced in your specific areas of focus. And I want to know, even thinking about just for a specific reference point, like broadband, for instance, we know we need to close that digital divide, but as we address that, we have to be sure that we're not actually widening it at the same time. So along those lines, how do we make sure that we don't undermine that which we're trying to achieve, no matter, in whatever sector? We've identified what those issues are. We've identified, we may not be in complete agreement around the common vision, but to take this moment and turn it into a movement. How do we not undermine ourselves is the question. And you all start, someone start.
Well, I'll take a shot at it from our perspective. I think at the Nebraska Community Foundation, particularly, I think our answer would immediately be, we do things with, never for or to, and I think that's key in that question. That's the way to avoid creating unintended consequences for the very people or populations or groups or whatever that we're trying to positively impact. They need to be at the table. Everybody's voice needs to be heard. That's how you create progress without unintended steps backwards. So that's certainly an oversimplification, and that is not a simple question, but I do know that's a foundational piece. You better be hearing from the people. They need to be part of the solution, whoever they is. We all need to be part of the solution. There cannot be any doing to or for anymore.
I would say on my perspective, and I agree with Casey, just a quite shift is we've got to have the key philanthropists to even be aware of what awareness is. It is amazing that there's a lack of awareness of broadband. What do you mean people don't have broadband? So having the key philanthropic givers aware that these data points exist, and then I hate to use this word, but a business value proposition to then desire to do something about it long term. A 12-month, let me throw you this, is not going to fix it. We need something that is long-term, systemic, and the key word is measurable, that, let's just be transparent, that can overlay and assist all included parties.
Casey, I would just second what you just said about inclusion and having a wide representation at the table, identifying these solutions. And I think along with that is, at least in long-term care, it's a very segmented industry, and it's easy to think of a solution, or not, maybe not easy, but you know, it's tangible, I guess, in a way, to like pick one part of the problem, right, and invest there and focus there. And I think that's what we have done historically, and I think that you do that because it's easier than taking on the bigger issues. And to me, that is the ultimate risk of this moment, is to get, you know, sidetracked and not keep the vision on that whole system and the whole big picture. And yes, it's scary and it's daunting and it's really hard, but that's where we have to go if we're going to have long-term change.
I think I would just ditto everything that's been shared already and give one really specific example. I failed to mention this earlier. I oversee our workforce development and job training portfolio here at the Urban League of Philadelphia. So I am in a role in direct service. Before I joined the Urban League, I was a funder. So I've been on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, and have worked very hard to recognize the inherent power structures that exist between grantee and grantor. Now in this current role, I feel like I get to say, hey, instead of us having a conversation about what am I going to do with your $10,000, I'd like to instead have a conversation about, these are the resources that I need to accomplish our common goals. And I think that this moment, I hope, is an opportunity for more organizations who are providing direct services to have more direct and intentional conversations with their funders, of course, predicated on trust, predicated that they are partners, mean that when they say partners, that they are willing to do with, not just for, and specifically have conversations about what are we actually trying to accomplish. I can't go public with this one yet, actually, but I'm working with a funder right now, nearing the finish line of an investment in equity. And for me, that was coming to them and saying, listen, I have a job training program that I have been running for years. In the last 8 months, there's been significant challenges for my students to participate because they're not working. They don't have computers at home. It is a difficult sell to engage an individual in a job training program on the promise that they may earn more. I came to that funder and said, what I need is money to pay someone to go through training so that they can sustain their families, so that they can actually focus on learning and upskilling and testing, so that they can purchase a computer if they need to because they're now studying at home. And they said, that's a really great point. I didn't think about that. Yes. So I think this is a moment how, to your question of how do we make sure that we're not undermining the things that we're trying to accomplish, being bold and being honest and being open and saying, this is actually what I need to accomplish what I want, instead of here's what I can do with what I have.
And from my perspective, I think it kind of goes along with all of this is confronting the root cause of the chronic underinvestment of people, right? Is our society not assigning a commensurate level of value to people? And it's a self-fulfilling outcome when those individuals continue to experience poverty or continue to underachieve based on where people expect that they should be because society is not investing in them. And as an example, just from an inclusive policymaking standpoint, as I've worked with members of the House and Senate and just talking about not disability policy, but labor policy or technology policy, right? It doesn't have to be a niche policy avenue. It can be more inclusive, better policy. And when you ask if they had at all considered, right, the unique circumstances of particular groups in the concept of their policy making, well, no, that hadn't occurred to them. And it's not because they're intentionally trying to disadvantage people. It's because it's not occurring to them because they're not assigning a commensurate level of value to people, right? And that's what we need to influence that as well.
Oh, those are all, again, rich, really rich responses. And I've gotten the green light that I get to keep going. So I have another question for you, and then maybe we'll take some from the field. So another question I've been thinking about is kind of more process oriented perhaps, but about this day after conversations, what it meant to gather these groups together, these different voices to bring people to the table. Do you see the day, I mean, if the day after conversation had not happened, do you see where else that conversation could occur, or has that seeded something that that you can see going forward in your communities?
I'll just quickly jump in that being in direct service is very easy to stay in direct service. My clients are everything to me, and for our organization, those that we serve and are engaging with take up the bulk of our mind space. So I really appreciated the opportunity presented by our National Urban League partners and with Peter and his team to just take a day or half a day to talk about these issues and to compare notes and think about how we might be able to work together outside of just the whirlwind of the day-to-day. So that unto itself, I would say, was incredibly valuable, just to have the intentional time outside, so to speak, to think about these.
I agree. I think I would just add that a lot of the people who participated knew each other and were some of them were in deep partnership with each other, solving the challenges that had come up for them over the past 8 months. But others, there were other voices at the table that weren't necessarily part of those conversations, but were other aspects of long-term care, or even we had somebody participate from outside long-term care too. And I think it just lent itself to a step back from the day-to-day. It lent itself to hearing other perspectives and other kind of voices that maybe you don't always hear from in your circle of getting your job done, right? And so I don't think that the conversation necessarily would have happened in another environment. I think that there's just such an interest in working on these issues together that I think it just sparked something that I think will hopefully continue. So that was good.
Yeah, I agree with Amy. We needed a convener. And for those that don't know Ronnie Bryant, he was probably one of the very few people that could pull, let's just be honest, C-suite executives and boots on the ground individuals together. So he was that one person in our city that could blend cultures, because if the C-suites are always in their C-suites and the boots on the ground are always on the ground, and the people that are in the middle, we're never really going to talk about what it takes place to give to the Urban League of Philadelphia. People give to who they have commonly given to without even second thinking it. So now it gave a greater justification that there's more than your normal nonprofit. So I would say the convener made the difference for us.
I think the certainly benefit in the conversation, in having people kind of come together and share an experience, and maybe taking a pause from being in the midst of the day-to-day fires that they're trying to put out, but also the value of bringing those things together in the theory of change or the documents to follow that the Institute is working on, that lays that out in a broader landscape. And there are commonalities that need to be addressed, and there are structural issues that need to be addressed. So that, I think, is going to provide a great deal of value to try and bring some attention.
I hope that our day after conversation in Nebraska anyway is sort of a model or an example of, just think about how many times just in this call that we have talked about reaching out to other people or including other people or reaching across silos or getting out of your box or whatever analogy you want to pick. I mean, that's clearly the theme here, right? And that's what, for us anyway, the day after conversation did, is it brought all those things together, all those different arms of both human and community and economic development. That should be the model, so that as we come out of 2020, as we come out of this extraordinary inflection point, we are looking at discovery, not recovery. And that would be my call to action to everyone here, is that, you know, we should continue that amongst this group, amongst every other group you're part of. We ought to be intentional about saying, all right, we learned that we've got to reach across some whatever barriers or borders those are, and do this stuff together. It's the only way to truly be successful.
Oh, those are great. Thank you so much. Shane, before we close, we have a quick question for you from Amber. She's asking, can you tell us where the results from the national survey that you mentioned are published?
Sure. So the Association for People Supporting Employment First, or APSE, APSE, they've been running a rolling survey on the impact of COVID. I think June, September, and then the next one is going to be released or fielded in early January. That's where we're able to add some questions about projecting into the long term. So that will go out into the field in January and hopefully return some results in February that can be shared out.
Wonderful, and I'm sure this network will be in communication, and that will be sent out to all participants. So I want to thank you all so much. What an incredible group of leaders you are, and I loved learning all about your conversation. So thank you again for sharing. It was wonderful. So I'm going to turn it back over now, Peter, and I guess we can all turn off our videos.
Fantastic, and good afternoon, everybody. It's Toby Sadiku here, and I am from the Kraft Heinz company. At Kraft Heinz, I am our global head of employee digital experience, and I look at how our employees can use technology to be productive, creative, and inspired. And I am so excited to be here this afternoon. Now, I'm sure you've all met these three fabulous people here. We've got Peter, who is the chair of the board. Peter, who's the founder and the chair of the board. Mary is responsible for our day after project. Apologies, Peter, I won't call you the chair. I'll be fair. You're the president and executive director. It's actually Ronnie who's the chair. Now, I'm sure you've all enjoyed this session so far. There's a lot that we've learned. In fact, some of the things that I've deducted from this is around the democratization of power I think that's one of the themes that I've heard rippled across throughout a lot of the other sessions. And it's clear that listening to the recording and listening to the session so far, that this Day After project was a worthwhile event. It actually leaves us on the edge of our seat wondering what next. And Mary, I want to hand over to you. Earlier, you mentioned how COVID-19 has highlighted some of the common threads that could be addressed through a cooperative movement. So can you speak to how the project feeds into the greater initiatives by the Institute?
Sure. Thank you for the opening to talk more about the Institute as a whole, as well as just this Day After conversation. We had great plans after a conference a number of years ago around the futures of work and how were we going to continue that conversation and bring it to a local level and be able to give localities a forum to talk about issues that would allow those communities to really flourish while they were able to really, as we would say, achieve the promise of work, which is to be able to have employment that allowed them to have family sustaining wages, would be allowed for equity, would allow for just sort of greater emphasis around talent and the individual worker and not so much on shareholder primacy. And a lot of the things that we have been talking about in achieving the promise of work and some of the issues that we saw on the horizon when COVID hit, we unfortunately looked a little prescient. That a lot of the issues that we thought were slowly coming towards us, I guess, or were now hitting us like a typhoon, and we really needed to react to them. So what the Day After conversations has really allowed us to immediately take hold of some of these questions that we wanted to address. What it's definitely demonstrated to us is that addressing these on a local or a industry specific level was really important to understand what was unique about a particular region or a particular industry. But we've certainly understood that the baseline issues are the same, but they're local flavors. It's sort of like many of us were very concerned when Macy's bought up all the department stores across the United States and wanted to call them all Macy's without recognizing that you were creating a retail store, but you needed to have local flavor. And I think that that's really certainly what we have learned here is that that understanding what's happening within an industry or location and being able to pull out the threads of commonality was really important.
Yeah, I really like that point actually, Mary, because you talk about having like the bird's eye view also with also being able to kind of dig deep in. I think that's quite interesting. And I know there's been limited financial support throughout the efforts. And actually on behalf of the Institute, I know we'd like to thank Source America for the support. It sounds like this was a grassroots movement. You know, you talk about the future of work or the future of like the future of work or the day after, they're huge names. It's really, really quite big themes that we're talking about. And it's remarkable what's been achieved thus far. So how is this achievement or what you guys have achieved, how does it differ to maybe what you were expecting? How has it grown? I know, Mary, you said there was some acceleration. This is probably a question to everybody.
Well, certainly, I mean, I think it's said to us that we certainly have sensed that there is a demand for what we are doing. I think you heard that from some of the participants, the ability to be together with people either that you knew well, but it gave you a chance to think about things, sort of the way we used to feel about conferences, right? That we had a chance to get out of the office and be able to experience a new surrounding and meet new people and and have that interaction and exchange of ideas. But I think it's also that sense of, and the fact that people actually had a chance to hear some different ideas and actually collaborate on things which they may have not recognized that they had that connectivity. So I think it's really demonstrated to us that there is a need to continue this and a need to then but there is a need to support it to be able to leverage it. I mean, Ronnie's been, and Peter have been doing, sort of coaching the Charlotte folks along, but they made quite clear that there needed to be ownership and there needed to be people who were willing to take it on and willing to support it. So it's demonstrating that it's like we've opened a door, but we need some additional folks to help us move it through.
Tavi, I would like to follow up on Mary's comments. I'd see the Institute as being the primer of the pump, if you will, in an effort we've started the conversation, we opened the door, and we've really given the respective communities the opportunity to convene around this discussion and then develop tools that will be unique in some ways, but really very common among various communities. But again, needing that local leadership in an effort to take charge and really start to put programs and initiatives and bring in other collaborators in an effort to improve the situations within that community.
I really like your theme there, Ronnie, because there's something about inviting people to the table and having an equitable and fair and democratized voice and opinion. And actually, if I push a bit further on that, earlier you talk about the theory of change. I'm sure if those of whom who are listening live or are going to be watching the recording, they'll be able to familiarize themselves with some of the white papers and some of the literature produced by the Institute. But could you tell us in a top line, like, what is the theory of change? What is it and what's the vision for it?
Thanks, Tapi. And just before I get into that, I want for everybody to note that this particular day, you will have seen 5 board members from the Institute who have contributed. Well, Celia is not on the call, but Celia being one of them, who've been really contributing to this effort with their own time and energy. So this has been a real bootstrapped operation. But as far as the theory of change is concerned, I mean, one of the issues that has really struck me over time, and actually was posed in one of the questions, was the question that was the point that silo is means segregation. And I think that's just a very apt way of describing it, because what I think we're seeing is that with these very individualized programs, we're seeing that separate does not result in equal and equitable. That and that what ends up, whether by design or by sheer accident, is that folks are all scrambling for the same crumbs. And so what we've been playing around with is an idea that borrows actually from the structure of worker and farm cooperatives, which is looking at a design that has collaboration that is based on people having direct skin in the game, that skin in the game can be both money as well as sweat equity, that the participants, those who are part of the collaboration, each has their own, has a place at the table, that the policy solutions should be systemic, and the programs then tie to those sort of systemic and comprehensive approaches, that they be built in, and this is one of the messages we've heard, sustainability, the basis to be able to support these ideas long-term, and as best as possible, self-sustaining. And then finally to value the collective knowledge of the stakeholders and to engage in a process of continuous learning and improvement that is constantly informed by the experiences in the community. So this isn't a cure-all solution, but it is the beginning of our approach in terms of what we want to be able to bring back to the communities that we're engaged in terms of next steps. I'm also being mindful of the time, so I want to be sure that we don't overstay our welcome with those who are watching. But as Tapi says, we're going to be putting these together in terms of white papers that will be available through our website, and then we will be gladly distributing it to folks as well.
Fantastic. And Peter, just while I have you here, I think it's really important to give you a couple of seconds maybe with a call to action. You know, everyone's spoken about the fact this is required a sincere level of effort from everybody involved, and it's been fantastic what the Institute has achieved so far. But if someone wants to get involved, if someone wants to contribute, how can anybody do that?
Oh, well, both, we do have a way on the website, the workandeconomy.org website, for people to contribute resources. You can also contact me directly through the website in terms of participation. We invite other communities to continue to add to our experience on this. We're not stopping this project. We're continuing to work on it even though we're bootstrapping it along the way. What Ronnie's speaking about, though, I think is critically important, and that is that where we don't have the resources and we want to acquire the resources, to be able to stick with the communities that we're engaged with for a period of time, so as to make that handoff, so as to identify partners and to continue to work with partners, so that what then gets done is done by the community or by the groups that we're engaged with, but something that we're able to sort of help facilitate, not just simply call a meeting and then drop it.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Ronnie, do you have one last moment here?
Yes, relative to the call to action, I really think the Institute, as Peter stated, will provide opportunities to get involved with us. But I think at the local level, you know, the pandemic has, over the last 10 months, has truly shown some of the inequities within our system, inequities that will directly impact our ability to collaborate on the future of work. And so, as an individual who wants to get involved, so to speak, pick your passion. Within our communities, there are inequities that need to be addressed, whether it's your inequality of your education system and the workforce training that follows that, whether it's inequity in housing discrimination, whether it's police brutality, but whether it's the inequity in the providing of health care within your communities. All of these inequities have been really exposed to a higher degree. And there are organizations that are on the front line that need your help. So pick your passion and find a way to get involved.
Yeah. Mary, thanks for that, Ronnie. Mary, I wonder, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, just hope that we'll see many of you in either at an additional conversation or at another convening that we hold, or at least send us your interest, and we'll be sure to try and get you involved.
Wonderful. Thank you.